Welcome to this edition of Pick Up the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the African Centre for Ideas programme through Jade Communications. It is part of a series of conversations on constitutionalism with the focus this time on the role of activism from civil society. I'm John Sibiokumu, and my guest is Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. For several years, he has been a regular newspaper columnist on the role of civil society in socio-political transformation. He has recently launched a book on the subject, and that is the focus of our discussion, with the title Dialogue and Dissent, a Constitution in Search of a Country, Kenya. Welcome, Mr. Irũngũ Houghton.
Asante, John.
Irũngũ, if I may, First of all, congratulations on the publication of your book. May I ask how long it took you to write it?
Actually, it took about 5 years, and the bulk of it was written in 2016. And with the articles, it's really been an editorial exercise since. So the last 6 months have been very intense. So I'm glad that it came out on Madaraka Day.
Well, I read it over the weekend.
Excellent.
But it's better for you to tell us in your own word, what's it about?
Yeah. Well, essentially, it's a biography of our Constitution. And when I started 5 years ago, I was really looking at how do we create a record of this moment. I knew it was going to be a historical moment. I also had it that communities would come to it to look at, some of the people who were really important in terms of either promoting the Constitution or protecting it. And I wanted to tell that story.
So let's get to the meat.
Sure.
The words activism and activist.
Right.
How would you define them to define our conversation?
Well, activism really is a passion and a belief that, that things have to change, things have to transform in order for us to have a country that keeps everybody safe and everybody dignified. And that's the primary the primary ingredient of the word activist, to activate, to cause change. I think that's the main kind of meat of what it means to be an activist.
I'll return to that later, as in subsections, subheadings, legitimacy of calling oneself an activist. But as I read it, Irũngũ, it seemed to me that your book ought to be a set book. Well, for one thing, that would make you very much richer.
No.
But I do believe that if we are in a population of 47 million people, and the statistic is that how many of them, what percentage is under 35?
Right.
70%, 65%. It seemed to me that the young, whom I know in that age group, are totally unfamiliar with the issues that you raise. So if we want change, if we don't incorporate the youth, is it worth discussing activism and activists?
Yeah, no, I think it is worth doing this, but I think you're raising an important point about generational disconnect and generational amnesia.
Yes.
I'm 55 years of age now, and one of the things that I'm present, much of what's in the book I lived through.
Yes.
If it's the stories of Wangari Maathai, if it's the stories of mothers of political prisoners, those are all events and moments that I can tell you firsthand what happened.
Right.
And I think the key thing for young people today is really to connect themselves to all the sacrifices and the, let's say it, the fun that the elder generation had.
Right.
And I think, once you connect to that space or to the previous generation, you will really get a sense of your importance and your sense of purpose today, rather than this real-time, ephemeral relationship with the issues that really matter.
I'm going to quote to you.
Thank you.
Page 16. Organizations are only as effective as the individuals who work within them. In a time of profound upheaval, it is to individuals that we must look to catalyze and bring people and organizations together. And you go on to talk later on about the power of one person. Now, if I may play devil's advocate, why should one person, if we have good governance, if we have the rule of law, would there be a need for people like Irũngũ Houghton?
I mean, it's not a satanic question, John. It's actually a very clear question to me, which is, laws in the absence of organized demands for their implementation are in some senses meaningless, right? There is, often when I go out into communities and I talk about the power of the Constitution, often people will come back to me and say, Irũngũ, that hiyo ni kitabu tu. It's just, in fact, in one funny example I got was somebody said to me, that was a calendar back in 2010. We've had several calendars since. And I think what's important is really that, organized public demand for implementation is probably what gives life and air to the constitutional freedoms and the obligations that we have. And that primarily is the responsibility of citizens. It's actually, as the book argues, it's not the responsibility only of the state. The state is obligated, but I think it is important for citizens to course correct their governments, to allow government to return to the source of why there is a government in a country, which is essentially to protect human rights, to expand freedoms, to expand prosperity, and to keep people safe.
We are seeds, bury us, we dare you. Another call to action quote from you. Who has the right to become a seed in a population of 47 million?
Everybody, and including the people who aren't citizens, refugees, people who are undocumented, those that are homeless, those that don't have access to health, education, haven't been to school. Those are really the seeds that I'm talking about there. That phrase essentially comes from a understanding that, many of the people in our history, were never recognized. They were never taken to State House and given awards. But we cannot talk about the significant shifts, from the colonial period to the post-colonial period to the second liberation of the 1990s without actually acknowledging that there were people who stood up. And this book is all about acknowledging those people.
Was there a continuum? Could we take our conversation to a look, first of all, to the past, and then to the present, and then to the future? And I'm trying to ask myself, as a citizen, whether the nature of activism has remained more or less the same. That is, charismatic, courageous, fearless individuals have stood up against something and mobilized other people. Or, as society becomes more and more sophisticated, as we have social media, as the capacity to communicate becomes more expansive, is the nature of activism static or evolving? As people always say, the trite observation, culture is dynamic. Is activism dynamic?
Activism completely dynamic. I mean, the first place to start really is to say that context is decisive, and context never remains the same. There are a couple of phrases that you often hear from activists, which is we're going back to the tyranny of the 1970s and 80s. And I always push back against that, because I think the first responsibility of an activist is to locate themselves in this current context and recognize that, everything that we try and move has an ecosystem of itself. You can't transform corruption, you can't transform police brutality, you can't transform forced evictions without understanding that those processes happen in an ecosystem, and that there are very powerful institutions that are actually causing whatever it is to happen. And that many times the people who are actually in charge of those institutions actually don't either recognize they have power to do something different, or they are completely enmeshed in the interests that leave millions of people without medical care, without housing, without education. And that it's the role of activists essentially to change that, and that context will shift. I have I have this comment that I usually make, is that if you're not confused, you're not paying attention. right? And this is because there is a, understanding I've reached that everything changes all the time, right? With Amnesty International, our work shifts every 3 months, right? We have a 3-year plan, we have a 1-year plan, but frankly speaking, we have to stop every 3 months and look at the context and recalibrate what we want to do with others. And that's the great thing. There's no reason for you to be fatalistic, cynical, have a sense of futility when you can see that the context is changing. And the question is not so much to be able to understand how the context is changing, but it's how to change the context.
I'm responding to the word cynicism,
right?
Being cynical.
Right.
And again, I'm going to read to you, where on page 81, a chance meeting with a tenderpreneur in the bar of a country club in 2015 illuminated this for me. She confidently told me I should have bribed the investigative officers at the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission and Office of the Deputy Public Prosecutor. It would have been cheaper. I ended up in court and then had to find the fixers. There are fixers in all the courts. Some can ensure your hearing date is not publicly listed, and others kill media stories. Some can secure delays, favourable bail terms and acquittals. It just costs money, that's all. So if you're going to steal, then steal a lot. You will need that money to pay for a lawyer and the long chain of legal fixers. Now you've said I, the Wananchi, have, it seems to me that the circles in which the birds are circling are by their very nature elitist. I'm still drawing you on this thing of how does the mama mboga on the ground end up in a country club as confronting a tenderpreneur? Because that's your basic thing, that we're all in this together.
Right.
I think it's a club of baddies against a club of goodies, and the rest of us are just waiting for you to get gongs and medals.
Right.
The goodies.
Well, no, actually, I don't have it that the world is full of bad guys and good guys. I mean, I literally feel that the us and them binary doesn't really help us. It's nice and simple, and it's great for movies, but actually for transformation, you have to be a bit more complex. Like one of the things that I, have found is that people are not static, right? People evolve, and there's a section in the book that talks about, our lives and the legacies that we leave are essentially.
We're not on the same page yet. I'm
Sure.
saying by our very nature, some of us are excluded from the process of activism.
No, absolutely not. I think if you have a pulse and if you have, a passion about anything, you are completely the kind of person that will become an activist. Right? And I can give you examples of this. Mama Victor. Mama Victor lives in Madare. We work with her very closely as Amnesty International. She saw 2 sons killed by police officers in unlawful, in unlawful ways, and she has continued to rise every month to go to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to ask when will her sons' killers be brought to court. Right now, she's a mama mboga. In fact, many times during the COVID period, her family went without any income. I think those are the people that I'm more interested in, or the parents of Yasin Moyo, the young the young teenager from Kiamaiko, who basically was shot on his balcony, one of the first deaths that we saw during the curfew. They get up and go to each court case as if it is the first case. And they told me that they are not going to rest until their sons' killers are brought to court. I can give you more examples of this than we have time. That's where the heartbeat of activism for me really resides. They're neither paid for it, they will probably not get any glory for it, but they will get the satisfaction of knowing that justice has been done for their family.
But you wrote the book. You
Sure.
know that the people that you highlight in your book in the final chapter
Right.
are what I'm going to call superstar activists. So these are people whose names have entered the public domain as heroic figures. And I think at one point in your book, you actually sort of have a new boy network where you name them by name. Boniface, Clifford, Eric, Gibson, John Allen, Oma, Paula, Phyllis, and Rachel. 9 names out of 47 million.
Right.
So is our salvation in the hands of 9 righteous folk?
No, I mean, I think 9 righteous folk are important to engage with and to learn from. And what's important in the book really is not what we already know about them, it's what we don't know about them. So there are 3 or 4 questions I asked each of them. One was, how do they handle fear? Right? Because at the time that I was writing the book back in 2016, the sense of activism as a risky, dangerous course of action was a very real one for me. And people just kept asking me, Irũngũ, you've done all this work around corruption, you've done all this work around human rights violations. Aren't you afraid? And I wanted people to interact with those 9 individuals with a real appreciation for their humanity, that they do experience fear, that they have very practical ways of dealing with it, and that they can keep going. And just to mention this, none of these people were born fearless. None of these people were born superstars. None of them were born, publicly recognized individuals. They were, like many of the 47 million people, unknown for most of their lives until they started taking a stand. And that's the thing about the book, which is that everybody, every human being, once they take a stand against something that is unjust, something that is harmful, that they too have the opportunity to rally others.
I'm still going to play devil's advocate.
It's okay, but you will get the reputation of being called a satanic advisor.
That's okay.
Okay.
I'm just suggesting here
Right.
that somewhere in this continuum, some people want their kids to grow up to be pharmacists, as a measure of success, lawyers, best of all, maybe in our climes, politicians. Are we to less and less so priests? Is my wish for my grandchildren that they become activists?
Yeah.
You need no qualifications. You just seem, a sense of outrage is of great help. A sense of courage is of great help.
It helps.
And then you brand yourself, you stand up for something, and then you get the all-important godfathers, protectors around your brand. Nobody is going to touch Irũngũ Houghton because it would create an international outcry. But Mama Mboga, if she's in a rally and the GSU are baton wielding, she's going to have her skull cracked. And I'm rather cynical about this thing about activism being a full-time job that affords a decent lifestyle and that has one jetting to have dinner with Bill Gates and Richard Branson. Am I right in being cynical?
Well, cynicism is like taking poison and expecting the person around you to die. So I usually tell people, please don't be cynical, because ultimately what it does is it erodes your sense of possibility for yourself and for your country. But let me speak to you as if I'm speaking to your grandchild, John. Activism is not a career. It's not a profession. It is definitely not something that you study for necessarily. And therefore, I would probably tell your grandchild, he or she, that they would look for a career, aim for something, and bring activism to that. And one of the things that I did in the book was I give examples of police officers, first ladies, medical doctors during the time of COVID, environmental warriors and public defenders and lawyers. And I say, what distinguishes them is not so much the career that they chose, but that they brought a sense of activism to that career. And I think that's how, 47 million people can bring, an impact that would leave us in a country that we could be proud of. So I don't think there is a career out there. I have great, maybe this is probably the area that we would probably both veer towards cynicism, which is, I have a level of skepticism that paid human rights advocates alone will be able to change the course of a country, right? As you know, in my work with Amnesty International, I emphasize voluntarism. I asked staff to go out and do things in their communities that will never show up in their performance, their performance reviews. Will definitely not lead to an increase in salary. And I tell people that actually it is more important for you to be located within your communities than essentially doing that which we as Amnesty would ask you to do. So membership is very important for me. Being able to, I guess, unleash 47 million people is really where my ambition is, rather than running a staff profile of tens of people that are protecting human rights.
This is the point in our conversation, because of the constraints of time,
Right.
where our genteel conversation gives way to some sort of quick fire questions which are a function of my notes.
Fire away.
Why is there a cult of the personality around superstar activists?
Yeah.
The cult of the personality,
Yeah.
that you can actually name names.
I mean, I blame Hollywood, and in the book I talk about the influence of Nollywood as an example. I do think that we gravitate to human beings more than large numbers of people. That it's easy for us to recognize, particularly in the Kenyan context, people who are like us. So I am very conscious that in the work that we do around human rights and rule of law and constitutionalism, that it is really important to have different and very diverse personalities and groups as well profiled. I think I'm 55, I'm heterosexual male, I'm a grandfather, I am a husband, I speak English faster than most people. I'm probably more comfortable in Kilimani than I am in Kiamaiko. It is important for people in Kiamaiko who are gay, who are who are also women, who are dispossessed, have a sense of kind of exclusion and marginalization, for them to have to have human rights advocates or public defender advocates who look and sound like them. Right, and I think that's where we need to be generating. We just need more of us. And I don't bash some of the so-called, the activists that are much more recognizable publicly, because they're just standing up and doing this. I mean, I think as I'm trying to remember his name, but the civil rights leader in the U.S. Recently, who was talking about Black Lives Matter, and they posed the same question to him and said, "Why are you on television all the time? Why are you tweeting all the time?" And Al Sharpton said back to them, this is what I do, right? If I was quiet, meek, and in the corner, you would not wake up, right? Now, I don't think there would be a need for superstar, loudmouthed, well-dressed, and social media prone activists if everybody was taking care of the country. I think you get the individuals being so pronounced because we don't have enough of them. So I think our job is to create others.
Why the dependence on external funding, giving rise to the accusation that activists are puppets of foreign masters?
Yeah.
And the other note, why the recognition of activists more outside Kenya than within?
Yeah. Well, all history has told us that, prophets are recognized first and foremost externally, then internally. The nationalist movements were recognized externally, then internally. So, there are a number of reasons for this, I think, and partly where you have a situation where there is either high levels of repression or, associating with people who are disruptive, if I can put it that way, of authority, is much more riskier in the context in which they're operating than outside. And that's why you get a sense, Bob Marley for a long time was much more recognizable in the United States of America and across the world than inside Jamaica for a long time. But I think the other thing about, your question, which I think is it's a really great question, is really thinking about, how it is that we can essentially support people to connect and to be more humble with their own role in the context of what needs to be done, right? And stepping back is a critical skill of an activist, which is that ultimately what you want is you want people to say, we did it ourselves, You want refugees to say, we protected ourselves. You want women to say, we stopped the sexism. You want gay people to say that, we stopped the homophobia, rather than it being continually related back to one activist or two activists.
Why are others who agitate for change in less confrontational ways not seen as activists by professional activists, to call them such? For example, nurses who go on strike, employees who protest for better wages. They're not in your book.
Oh, they're definitely in my book. Definitely in my book. Yeah, actually, Stephen Mugiso is in my book. The medical union and the strike is in my book.
Medical.
No, he was a young.
Yes.
He was under. I think he was under 30.
Right.
He died of COVID.
Enough, but I do want to get some more questions in.
Okay. I have lots of people there.
I'll reread the book.
Yeah, no, I have lots of people in there. But I think your point is a broader point, right? Yeah. It's about, how do we make sure that more people are recognized and are honored really for the kind of things that they do. And in that book, I speak about a first lady who encouraged the country to run for maternal health care. And I know that is going to be a controversial part of that book because she's right next to Boniface Mwangi. Right. And I know the two communities will look and will probably ask me in the next print of the book to separate them into two separate paragraphs. But I thought it was really important, to really capture this idea that if you are passionate, if you are standing for something and you're enrolling a country around that, you are an activist. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the streets of Nairobi or not, or any other capital.
Right. I'm going to ask you the last question because it has to be the last one, maybe the last two. And that is to say that worldwide, we are moving to a much more authoritarian world where people are creating strictures, where boundaries are becoming, 50 years ago, you could decide to go and make a life in Papua New Guinea.
Right.
It's going to be slightly different. 50 years ago, you could decide I'm going to the United States, but there is a clamp down and a closing in. And with that, an appeal to authoritarianism. What do you see as the future of activism if that is the prevailing universal climate? Well, how are activists going to fight back? How am I going to say, would it be nice for me to go and live in Zimbabwe for a year? Right.
Well, the first thing I think is just to see this as a season. I mean, in terms of history, there have been seasons of authoritarianism. There have been other seasons of liberal, democratic societies. And, in the same way that we saw 4 years of the Trump administration, essentially turn a country that for many people, not necessarily everybody, but for many people was a much more open, democratic society, turn into this really dark part of the planet. We've seen that transform in a couple of months, and I'm sure the Black Lives Matter will continue to push for safety and freedom for black men on the streets of the United States of America. But the fact of the matter is that you see space being shrunk and it opens up again. And I think at the center of all of that, you will always find active citizens and, organizations of active citizens pushing back against authoritarianism. So I think that's the calling, that we saw in the 1980s across many parts of Africa. And that's the calling that we need to see in the 2010s onwards.
Irũngũ, I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
And all success for your book. And thank you for watching or listening to this conversation on Pass the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the Africa Center for Ideas program through Jade Communications. Till next time.